Today I have two horrifying outdoor disaster stories for you that reveal how a seemingly normal day can turn into an ordeal with destruction and death around the corner. It was the adventure of a lifetime for 9 fishermen on board the Enchanter for a 5-day fishing trip to the Three Kings Islands in March 2022. Tragedy struck and chaos broke loose after the crew realized they were in a nightmare scenario. The Enchanter was on a shallow reef and they were too close to the shore and in the firing line of huge seas. The ship was a couple miles off the coast and wandered into an area notorious for destruction. The Three Kings Islands are a group of islands in New Zealand where the South Pacific Ocean and the Tasman Sea converge. Three Kings are one of the more isolated islands, and there are rumors of record-breaking sized fish there. It is primarily untouched, and people want to catch the big kingfish and marlin in those seas. Getting there is not easy because you have to cross a large body of water with strong currents and go through a strait where the Tasman and Pacific Oceans meet. The men on the bucket list fishing trip paid nearly $2,000 each for the opportunity. Nat Davey has been a commercial fisherman for 26 years and believes the Enchanter captain, Lance Goodhue, shouldn't have left the Three Kings Islands when he did, or at least waited until things subsided. The conditions were atrocious, and for some unknown reason, Lance went past 2 good anchoring spots and proceeded with the trip's original planned route. Other fishing charters made the call not to go out on that fateful day due to the rough weather conditions. Nat revealed he complained about Lance Goodhue to Maritime New Zealand 2 months before the incident, claiming Lance had taken clients fishing when there was a cyclone in the forecast. Lance Goodhue loves the sea and fishing. He has dedicated his life to living and working on the ocean for over 250 days a year and for the past 25 years. Lance established Enchanter fishing charters in 1995. He is known to push the limits, and as a result, he lands his customers the fish of their dreams. He prides himself on results and providing top-notch entertainment, and as a result of all of that, he has a lot of loyal customers, but he also has some enemies. Public records show Lance Goodhue has previously pleaded guilty to safety breaches. He was one of the 4 fishing vessel charter operators convicted and fined for working illegally outside their safe operating limits in 2009. The men who signed up for this trip, as well as Lance, were well aware of the local weather service's warnings predicting very bad conditions in the area. The Enchanter set out in March 2022. The start of the trip went well, with 3 days of excellent fishing. The group got what they paid for, and they were excited to make it back home to tell their friends and family about their exploits. On their way back, they took a route around the North Cape. Reports stated severe weather was passing through and all the ships should make their way immediately to a harbor. The conditions went from safe to extremely dangerous before the Enchanter could get out of the rough seas. However, the group trusted their captain Lance, and he informed them that it was going to be a bumpy ride on the way back. The men sheltered around the Three Kings Islands Sunday, March 20th, as high winds, rain, and flooding battered the fishing charter. Experts say rogue waves, once a maritime myth, are extremely rare, but they can happen. Waves of different frequencies traveling in different directions can sometimes superimpose to produce an individual wave significantly larger than those that precede or follow it. The boat entered a notorious stretch that's claimed at least 4 ships in 20 years. The waves were so big they stood up, and some would break over the entire boat, splashing water in every compartment. With no warning, a rogue wave over 30 feet high slammed over the top of the Enchanter and ripped the boat to pieces. The men were plunged into the water with glass and debris scattered everywhere. Struggling to breach the surface, they feared they would drown. Some of them thought they were going to die, others thought they were already dead. The boat was upside down with the propeller still spinning and black smoke everywhere. It was like something out of a movie in total chaos. Kobe O'Neill was dazed when he finally managed to breathe again, but quickly came to as he surveyed his surroundings. He was lying in a pile of dead fish and wasn't sure if he was in a dream or if what was happening was real, but he knew that he was in a terrible place when the boat ripped apart. The seriousness of the situation wasn't immediately apparent to him. Jade Cook was flung off the boat when the wave hit. Somehow he wasn't severely injured and could manage the waves and swam back to the boat to look for the other group members. He was expecting to see all of his mates laughing at him for falling off of the boat. Instead, he wasn't sure if they were dead or alive and knew that the only way he would survive is if he was rescued. Richard Bright, Mike Lovett, Jeffrey Allen, Mark Walker, and Mark Sanders were still unaccounted for. Kobe, Jade, and Ben started frantically looking for them while simultaneously fighting for survival. They started working their way around the capsized boat while dodging sharp, blunt objects thrown at them by the waves. Something bobbing in the waves looked out of place from the rest of the boat debris. One of the group swam close up to the object and realized it was Mike Lovett. He was just floating in the water, unresponsive. They pulled him onto the boat's roof and tried to resuscitate him, while also trying to not get knocked off the boat themselves. They tried over and over to get Mike to breathe, but nothing worked. Mike was dead. Mark Walker was in his bed when the wave struck, and he was trapped inside as the water rushed into the cabin. He was sealed in, and there was no way for him to overpower the strength of the water pressure against the door. He drowned inside his bunk room. As the sun started to fade, the men tried to scramble up the slippery pieces of debris to save themselves from the freezing waters that lurked beneath them. At this point, none of the group members thought they were going to live. It was survival of the fittest, and they had to have a miracle happen in order to escape this nightmare situation. Shay and Jade sought refuge on the hull, and Ben, Lance, and Kobe were on the boat's roof. They had limited space that was not totally submerged in the sub-zero water, so they stayed in their respective spots. They would yell out, trying to communicate with each other, but it was useless in the violent storm. Then, what was left of the shredded boat started to rip apart, and the group of men began to drift away from each other. Shay and Jade quickly faded off into the distance as the ocean took them hostage. Things couldn't get any worse for them at this point, and the debris that kept the men afloat soon began to sink into the waves and below the surface of the water. Shay had a pregnant wife at home, and thoughts of him never seeing her again or his child made him very sad. He was bleeding heavily from an injury at the top of his thigh and confided in Jade. Shay thought he was bleeding out as they drifted into the darkness while getting smashed by oncoming waves. There was a light flashing in some of the debris, and one of the men grabbed it and took a closer look. It was an emergency radio beacon. To their surprise, it seemed to still be working, but they were not really sure. They immediately used it to send a signal to rescuers. Shay prayed that the emergency beacon was in working order. After 3 hours in the freezing water, clinging to debris for their lives, a helicopter appeared and took them safely to the shore. While investigations by Maritime New Zealand and the Transport Accident Investigation Commission into the tragedy are ongoing, the survivors are still coming to terms with the loss of their friends. Ben Stinson revealed that he was still struggling with the feelings of survivor's guilt. And when asked how he was dealing with it, he said, "I'm not sure whether I am dealing with it or not." Sadly, Richard Bright, Mike Lovett, Jeffrey Allen, Mark Walker, and Mark Sanders all died during the fishing trip on the Enchanter. Story number 2. They couldn't see or breathe. Rogers Pass is a high mountain pass through the Selkirk Mountains of British Columbia. In the heart of Glacier National Park, it's been a tourism destination since 1886 and is a National Historic Site. The students of Strathcona Tweedsmuir School, a prestigious private school near Calgary, were ecstatic when told that their next school trip would be a 4-day backcountry skiing expedition through Rogers Pass. The overnight trip to Glacier National Park was a rite of passage for STS students, something they had anticipated since the start of the school year. Rogers Pass is considered one of the safer backcountry locations to explore, but it's certainly not exempt from danger. The school had conducted dozens of trips to Rogers Pass over 10 years without incident. Teacher and group leader Andrew Nicholson, also known as Mr. Nick, had been on several of these trips. The excursion is part of the school curriculum, which said that students were to examine the consequences of their actions concerning the environment. Mr. Nick was a great leader for this trip, and his passion and experience in the outdoors was a great resource to the students. Early Friday morning, January 31st, 2003, 14 students got into the bus in the parking lot and prepared to start their exciting mountain skiing expedition. After 5 long, anxious hours driving down the Trans-Canada Highway, the bus pulled up in front of Rogers Pass Discovery Center. Mr. Nick hopped off the bus, spoke briefly with officials, and picked up a Parks Canada bulletin that evaluated local snow conditions. There was a large amount of rainfall in the earlier months that had created a layer of granular ice crystals wedged between loosely packed snow that was failing compression tests throughout Glacier National Park. The students had a great time skiing that day on the mountain, and everything was going according to plan. Mr. Nick enjoyed his time instructing the students, and they were excited to wind down after a full day of activity on the mountain. Before the sun set around 5:30 p.m., they arrived at the Arthur O. Wheeler Hut, a beautiful 3-room log cabin owned by the Alpine Club of Canada. This place is like something out of a magazine, and the students appreciated it. Next, they got to work hauling firewood and prepping food for dinner. Then, the students planned their trip for the following day and had decided on 2 different routes. The snow conditions were similar in both routes, but they chose the one that was easier to navigate. Everyone slept well that night, and anticipation for the next day's adventure was high. They got up at 9:30 the following morning. It was a perfect day to challenge the rugged terrain. The plan was to ski to Belleau Pass, tracing from the bottom of Connaught Creek Valley. They would stay on the eastern side of the creek. The western side of the valley was steeper and starker, leading up to the summit of Mount Cheops. If things went smooth, it would take them about 3 hours in total. There are no chairlifts in remote areas like this, and skiers are on their own when moving uphill. Similar ascents can be done on skis, other sections requiring hiking. The STS group planned to slowly gain altitude for the first half of the trip, allowing for a long, luxurious descent on the way back. It was hard work, and they stopped to refuel at about the halfway point. At 11:45 a.m., the students took a break at the forest edge and prepared to cross their second major path. They looked out at where the runoff from multiple peaks would collect. Across the valley, on the far side of the creek, the summit of Mount Cheops was hidden behind low clouds moving slowly behind the ridgeline. The gray mountain ranges stretched for hundreds of miles in every direction. Standing in the middle of it felt like being on another planet. There was no wind, the air was cool and silent except for the murmur of skis atop untouched snow. The group pushed north toward Belleau Pass. An hour later, they stopped to sip tea from a thermos and take in the scenery. Then, suddenly something horrible happened that struck fear deep into the souls of the trip guides. There was no heads up or any indication about what was to happen besides a loud crack, followed by a massive avalanche crashing down from the peaks of Mount Cheops. The school group was directly in its path. A school guide tried to warn them, shouting, "Avalanche," but his attempt was futile. They could only watch as the snow barreled down the mountain and back up the far side of the valley towards the unsuspecting group. Student Will Johnson didn't hear the crack, but stopped in his tracks and tried to locate the source of the shouts. Instinctively, he looked uphill but found the landscape undisturbed. So he turned downhill to face Connaught Creek Valley and Mount Cheops on the western side. The clouds initially hid the avalanche from view, but Will watched as an avalanche burst through the coverage and thundered down Mount Cheops' jagged face. Then, one of the guides further up the mountain had his backpack off, his skis off, and was ditching everything. Additionally, down the mountain, the group and the guides had no time to do anything and tried to ski off, but they were blasted with a wall of snow and debris. The avalanche was massive, about 2,500 feet wide and a mile long and 15 feet at its deepest. It was large enough to topple a building or destroy 10 acres of forest. It was traveling at 90 miles per hour and swallowed everything and everyone in its path. By some miracle, it looked like some of the guides popped out of the barrage of the avalanche. At first, the snow was fluid, but once it settled, it felt like concrete. Will couldn't move anything, not even wiggle his fingers. He had no idea which way was up or down and could only see darkness. Disoriented and panicking, he realized he had just been buried alive. Snow was packed so tightly around him that it prevented his chest from expanding. Every time he breathed through his nose, his ribs hit a snow wall. His mouth was packed with snow. It was terrifying. Will couldn't even hyperventilate because his lungs were compressed. His only hope of survival was that someone had managed to escape the avalanche and that a search would soon be underway. While in his mummified state, he started praying. His body temperature plummeted as blood rushed to his core to protect his vital organs. Hypothermia was the least of his worries. He was running out of air and had to start counting out his breaths. He knew that eventually he wouldn't be able to breathe anymore, and he would eventually pass out. After watching the group below them disappear, the other guides braced for the inevitable impact. Blinded by a powder cloud generated by the force of the avalanche, they waited for the snow to overwhelm them. Trip expedition leaders Abby Watkins and Rich Marshall were alive topside and the only people in the world who knew that the school group was in trouble. The threat of a second avalanche was still very possible. The guides knew that valuable seconds were ticking away. After half an hour, the survival rate of an avalanche victim drops to 50%. At 45 minutes, it's less than 30. If a person is buried without an air pocket, it's the same thing as being underwater. Carefully, Abby and Rich skied to the edge of the runout zone of the avalanche and spotted a glove sticking out above the snow. The hand belonged to Mr. Nick. Once his face and upper body were cleared, they left him to dig himself out as they moved on to search for other beacon signals. Finding their leader was the first stroke of luck. He carried the group's only satellite phone and immediately called for help, then joined the guides in the desperate search for the rest of the students and guides. Student Will Johnson blacked out beneath the snow. It wasn't painful. He was conscious 1 minute and gone the next. Then, just as suddenly as he had thundered back into the waking world, he was standing atop the snow, struggling to zip up his jacket with no idea how he had gotten there. Then, he realized that people had just dug him out. He was literally brought back from the dead. Will immediately started digging to try to find the others buried in the snow. Together with Abby and Rich, they had uncovered a fourth person, and several others were starting to show up on the scene. In under an hour, 7 helicopters, 48 rescuers, and 3 rescue dogs were on the hill. The rescuers then told the guides to move on, which was when Will realized that people had died. Dazed, with the dead body of a friend at his feet, he surveyed the destruction. Starting out across the avalanche, Will spotted a vertical probe, then another and another, all marking burial sites that were quickly becoming graves. The rescue was spread across a square mile, and Will desperately scanned for his friends. At that point, he knew of 5 survivors, himself included, and one of the deceased. Helicopters had already started taking people off the hill, and it was possible that others had made it. However, if another avalanche occurred, it could take out the entire group and the rescue crew, so they wanted to evacuate quickly. Will got into the rescue helicopter and was airlifted to Glacier Park Lodge, where he hoped to find the rest of his friends and class. It wasn't until he reached the hotel that he found others huddled together in a small room that he understood what had happened to his friends. Will Johnson knew he should feel grateful that he was among the survivors. He couldn't come to terms with the outcome. The trauma of the event caused him frequent panic attacks, and there were nights when lying on his back, eyes probing in the darkness, he felt the rise and fall of his chest and counted his breaths. Ultimately, 7 students, some of them Will's friends, were dead. As details of the disaster emerged, the news was met with disbelief, anger, devastation, and a never-ending list of questions. Why were these students brought into a hazardous situation? Who decided to take them there? And why, with technology, were they not able to predict an avalanche? Much criticism was directed at the STS school, but they also received countless letters of support following the tragedy. A lengthy investigation concluded that their deaths resulted from a horrible accident. Thanks for watching the video, and remember to subscribe if you like the content. As always, please be extra nice to the like button, and I have many other disaster videos on my channel for you to check out. See you at the next one.